So I will say something about the part of Prior's work that had to do with theology, and that was something he was very much occupied with in his youth, and much of the stuff that he worked with there followed him throughout his authorship and his professional career, and enriched his philosophy and enriched his philosophical work, and he actually it turned out he actually was quite on top of many things, which had he lived on, he would definitely have continued in many of the theological discussions that ensued after in the 60s, began in the 60s. And one of them is the discussion about Scientia media, which is still a central position in much of the theological discussion about God's foreknowledge and human freedom. And so what I'm going to say something about here is some of these, many of these dates, of course, how his, but the important thing here is sort of the relation between the 1942 article, which is God's plan and purpose, which was work done on the Westminster Confession of Faith, and Prior worked extensively with that in the early 40s. And in here he speaks about Scientia media. And then, of course, this 1962 article, Formalities of Omniscience, which was a very, very influential article in terms of launching the movement, which is sort of as a contribution to analytical theology. This is a movement which is growing, especially in America, analytical theology, but Prior was actually working much with that already in the 40s. So we need to speak about the young Prior. He's here in a picture from Edinburgh in 1938. Can you find him?
Yes, right in the middle.
Right in the middle. Yeah. You have him. He's 20. How old is he there? He must be in 1938. 28 years old, I think he is at that time. No, 24 years old. 24 years old at that time.
Where did you say this picture was?
This is from a book, the Proceedings of the Calvinistic Congress in Edinburgh, where he participated as a religious journalist. That's what we know from Anthony Kelly. That's what he called himself at that time. He was touring Europe with his first wife, Claire, and they were writing up on conferences. And this is the guy who owned the book. He's from Hungary. And it's very interesting that I found this book on the internet and bought it, and his name is written on top of that. And then there is this picture inside the book of where everyone participating at that conference were there, and Prior was standing there to the man, I just forgot his name, who owned the book. And it's very interesting that inside all the names are written of these people. And Prior, he had described himself as a theological student at that time. So he was not participating as a philosopher, even though he in 1937 graduated as a philosopher. He still called himself a theological student, a student of theology in 1938. For whatever reason he did that, there could be practical reasons for doing that. When you want to participate in a theological conference, maybe it's easier to call yourself a theological student, but that wouldn't look like Prior. I think he would not be afraid of writing. He was a philosopher. But anyway, there he is. And some of the things he worked with extensively throughout his youth and also into his as you know, in Formalities of Omniscience, is God's foreknowledge and human freedom, which is a very long discussion in the church history. You have the most strong, maybe the strongest tradition in Christianity in terms of theology is the deterministic branch, or one of the strongest at least. And it goes to many of the big theologians the church have had, Catholic as well as Protestant theologians, and is still a strong tradition in Christian thinking today. The idea that God determines all future events expressed by Augustine this way: "For to confess that God exists and at the same time to deny he has foreknowledge of future things is the most manifest folly." He's discussing that with Cicero. Of course, he's not discussing with him. It's like 500 years later. But sort of, he's taking up that argument from Cicero that God cannot know. You cannot predict future events because that would take away freedom. And Augustine is agreeing with that it requires determinism to know future events. But it's no solution to say that there are no knowledge, that God has no knowledge of future events. That would be the most manifest folly. But nonetheless, that's what we have today. We have a rather distinguished tradition now today in beginning to grow in Christian thinking, or theistic theology, you might say, theistic philosophy, presented by people like William Hasker, Gregory Boyd, Clark Pinnock, Richard Swinburne, and Peter van Inwagen, who argues that God does not have foreknowledge of future free events. So a free action, if something is a free action in the future, God cannot know it, because if he knew it, he would determine it. So these two things are mutually exclusive. So they would follow Cicero actually, but the influence from Prior is very evident. Even Hasker is the first one of these to notice it in the 80s, where he writes that the modern controversy over the compatibility of divine foreknowledge and human freedom, begun in the 1960s by Nelson Pike and A.N. Prior, has so far failed to reach a satisfactory conclusion. And so the first one who wrote here, Nelson Pike, wrote, I think it was in 67, an article, but Prior wrote in 62. So Prior is definitely the first one of these two to have sort of opened up and launched that discussion. And what made it possible for him to do that was his work on determinism, of course, and his background, theological background, which gave him that kind of knowledge over the whole discussion of God's foreknowledge and human freedom. So, but we have one of the reasons that this, in Prior's writing, the determinism discussion in Prior's writing, it ends with all these logical models. Like you have this perspective, you can take the alchemist route, and you can take the Priorian route. Or you can have different strategies, and we have a thin red line, and we have many models for the future. And that's also the case in theology. It hasn't reached any conclusion. But what happened in the 70s was that the work of Luis de Molina, which is depicted here, photography taken somewhere in the 16th century. Yeah, it was a pass photo or something like that. He wrote in 1588 in Concordia, a large work in which only one of the volumes has been translated so far. The part that has to do with his Scientia media. He actually entered into a discussion at that time with the Thomists about God's foreknowledge and human freedom, arguing that there is a possibility to argue for human freedom in being compatible with a sovereign God who is very much in charge of everything. And much of his thinking was influenced the discussions between Arminians and Calvinists at the Synod of Dort in the beginning of 16th century. But then actually sort of grew out of the picture, and people, it died out, and in modern times it hasn't really been a position taken up by philosophers in their arguments, until Plantinga comes along. Plantinga is in a book called God, Freedom and Evil, giving a defense of the problem of evil, where he argues a free will defense for the problem of evil, and he uses an argument that makes use of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom and God's foreknowledge of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. And he just does that without knowing the tradition, apparently, because he attends a meeting with Anthony Kenny. And okay, I'm just skipping a little here. He was attending a meeting with Anthony Kenny, And at that meeting, he writes about that meeting, at a Council for Philosophical Studies, I gave a version of the free will defense in which I took it for granted, both that there are counterfactuals of freedom and that God's omniscience includes his knowing their truth values. Anthony Kenny was present at the Institute and declared that I was a Molinist. I wasn't sure whether that was a commendation or a condemnation, but as it turned out, the whole subject of counterfactuals of freedom and God's knowledge of them had been debated and explored at length in the 16th century. So he was inadvertently making use of that whole idea of counterfactuals of creative freedom in his defense of the problem of evil. And Anthony Kenny, who was very close to Prior at Balliol, he described the influence Prior had on his thinking with his early theological work. He was aware of the early theological work of Prior, Anthony Kenny, and before he even got acquainted with Prior. So the connection between Kenny and Prior is very close, and it's very interesting that we have actually found in the archive at the Bodleian Library this paper called Of God's Plan and Purpose, written probably in 1942, in which Prior says this: Jesuits and Armenians, however, taught that there was a third kind of divine knowledge in between these two. I'll explain what these two is later. Scientia media, which was neither knowledge of what was merely possible, nor a knowledge of what he himself had decreed, but a knowledge of what was bound to happen because certain other things had happened, or because he had decreed certain other things. So this is a quote wherein he is describing that section of the Westminster Confession that has to do with God's foreknowledge of future events. It might be a good idea to just look a little bit on Molinism. What is the theory of Molinism? It has received a lot of attention after Plantinga's work, and especially this is taken from from Flint's book on divine providence, where he's a Molinist, and he's not ashamed of it. He doesn't take that as a condemnation, but as a good position to hold in the question. And the idea is this: that this should be perceived as the knowledge God has prior to the creation event, prior to the moment where God pushes the Big Bang button or now I'll create button. If you imagine the thought that is present with God, the knowledge that is present with God, not understood temporally. It's not like God first knows the natural knowledge and next moment he has middle knowledge and the next moment he has free knowledge. It doesn't have to be that way. It can be in a logical succession of events. And so the first kind of knowledge we can distinguish in God is what is called natural knowledge, which is his knowledge of necessary true propositions, like 2 + 2 is 4, and no circles have corners, and other propositions like that. And these kind of propositions are propositions that obtains independently of God's free will. So the idea is that if something is necessarily true, it is something that, in terms of all possible worlds, possible world semantic, that God, no matter what world God will create, it will be a world in which every circle has no corner, even though they are boxing rings. So it obtains independently of his choice. There are these two characteristics. The free knowledge, on the other hand, is the knowledge of what will be a contingent true in that world. Like George Bush was president in USA on September the 11th, 2001. God knows that the moment he creates. The moment he pushes the create button, he's aware of that future fact. But it's a contingent fact. He's aware of it as a contingent fact. It could have been otherwise. So, and he's aware that it depends on my free will. I could have created another world. And that means that there is some kind of middle knowledge in between these two, which is a mixture of these two kinds of facts that God is aware of. Like free knowledge, middle knowledge is a knowledge of contingent state of affairs. Like if Bush had lost the election, then that Gore would have been president in USA on September the 11th, 2001, presumably. God knows that. He knows a counterfactual, not something that will happen. Of course, it's contingent because it could have been otherwise. And then he also knows it as something that obtains independently of his free will. And that's the crucial point in modernism. That this will be an event that creatures decide in that possible world. There's an election event and a bunch of free creatures goes into election booth and they push a free button, or someone is cheating in Florida by their own free will, so Al Gore loses, or whatever you want to say. But some kind of free event is involved in that event. So it's something that is independent of God's free will. That gives you three kinds of knowledge of God. So here the Molina says, here is the tool you can use if you want to have a sovereign God and a free human being. Humans are free in the libertarian sense, meaning that they could, if you are in a morally significant state or circumstance in which you ought to do A, you could do not A. So you are free in that sense. But God just has foreknowledge of that event and can decide to create those circumstances in which He knows that you would do what He favors that you do. That's sort of the idea with modernism. But He also knows, of course, that if I were to create that circumstance, then it's not up to me whether Adam eats of the apple or not, or Eve eats of the apple or not. That's sort of the idea in modernism. So you have statements in the Bible that sort of confirms this, Molina says. One of his favorite examples, Molina, is the situation in which King David is outside the city of Keilah, and he's asking God, if I go into Keilah, will Saul come down? And if Saul, who is persecuting him, King Saul is persecuting him, and then he says, if Saul comes down, will the citizens of Keilah surrender me to Saul? And then God says, yes, they will. And then he doesn't go in. So he's asking him for a knowledge of something that is counterfactual. And God is capable of giving that knowledge. And Molina says, assuming that they are free, this is middle knowledge. The idea. So if we turn to Prior's branching times, of course, this is the one Prior chose to believe in terms of the future. We can see that Prior had no idea. For Prior, the future is not determined yet. There is no truth about which of these future propositions will be true. So there are no arrow. The arrow only leads to the now. So there is no knowledge of the future. So that's an important fact for Prior, this fact that there is no knowledge of future, what is true in the future. And in his alchemistic branching time, he has an idea about what is true in the future, but it is conditioned upon the course of time, so it's relative to a chronicle. And so in none of these models you find room for modernism. First of all, in none of these models you have counterfactuals. You only have the future, and yet you don't even have a future which is preferred as the one that will happen, the true future. And Ostrom introduced that later in terms of the idea of a branching time in which you have a line that designates what will happen, and a future which is designated as what will happen, and you also have a counterfactual future which designates what would happen at that now in the counterfactual future. So this is actually the model you might use if you wanted to be a modernist. That's why it's also often called modernistic view on branching time. So the interesting thing is that it turns out that Prior was aware. And not only in 1942 he was aware of the idea of Scientia media, and I will turn to him in a moment to his rejection of it. But he was aware of that. But it also turns out that Prior actually was aware of what is called the thin red line, or the true future idea. When he says, in these models, the course of time, in a rather broad sense of this phrase, is represented by a line which, as it moves from left to right, past to future, continually divides into branches, so that from any given point in the diagram there is a unique route backwards to the left, to the past, but a variety of routes forward, to the right, to the future. In each model there is a single designated point representing the actual present moment, and in an alchemistic model there is a single designated line taking one only of the possible forward routes at each fork, which might be picked out in red, representing the actual course of events. Very interesting that Prior was aware of that idea. And we're speaking in the 60s here. So we are speaking quite a time before the whole discussion kicks off about Molinism in the 70s. So very interesting that had Prior lived on, it definitely would have been an issue that he was very well capable of taking up and continuing in the discussion of this, because he already talked about Scientia media in 1942. So in the 1942 article, Prior rejects the idea of Scientia media. And his rejection of it seems to go something along these lines, that there are future events that follow from God's decree, which God doesn't have control over, but nonetheless knows. So for Prior, that's sort of the idea that God doesn't have control over them. They are counterfactuals but they are not something God has control over.
Did I hear you right? That was the 42 paper.
Yeah.
God's plan and purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. And there he says these events are inevitable consequences. He speaks about them as consequences of the various circumstances in which God decrees to place them. That's how he describes those counterfactual circumstances. And therefore the freedom of Scientia media is guaranteed by an impersonal system of necessary connection outside God's control. So seems to the Prior is thinking that if it's outside of God's control, therefore it is impersonal system of necessary connections. Something that seems to cause the being to do what he does in those situations. So Prior is envisioning an idea that seems to be that he knows those counterfactuals of counterfactual actions, but it's very unclear if they are free actions, because they are necessary connections that causes them to do these things in those situations. Because therefore he concludes it's not freedom from necessity. You don't get freedom from necessity by this. You just outsource the necessity to counterfactual circumstances. So what Prior is assuming here is that what he's not assuming in this model is libertarian freedom. He's assuming maybe some kind of deterministic thing that goes on in those possible circumstances that is not a determinism by God, but something else in those circumstances. Maybe your surroundings or your feelings or whatever. So therefore it's not freedom from necessity, but only the direct designing of God. That's the kind of freedom you get in those possible worlds, he says. You only get freedom from a direct designing by God, by outsourcing it to something else that will direct you. So this is his conclusion, which is fundamentally theological. It's very interesting that he is very theological in the 40s, Prior. He's very theological in the way he's thinking. He says this, Jesuit Armenians use these doctrines as a means of reconciling predestination and free will. God, they argue, did not predestine men to believe or not to believe, but foreknew and accepted their belief or unbelief as the inevitable consequences of the various circumstances in which he decreed to place them. The freedom safeguarded by this device seems a very empty one. It is freedom only from the direct designing of God, but complete slavery to an impersonal system of necessary connections. And Calvinists did not fail to point out that the only significant outcome of the scheme was to divert our faith and trust as to our ultimate destiny from God alone to God plus necessity. So it's clear that the reason why Prior rejects this is that he doesn't believe it gives you any freedom. It just gives you freedom from God's determining you in those circumstances. So it's a strictly theological reason he uses for rejecting Scientia Media, which explains why he wasn't really giving any attention to it as he took up the discussion of determinism and free will. I think for him the discussion could be boiled down to knowledge of the future, because what you have there is what you have everywhere. You have determinism, and in the now you have either a determinism by there being truth about what will take place, and that's also what you will have in counterfactual nows, in counterfactual future. So you just have more of the same. That seems to be his assumption here, because he says this, which seems interesting. He uses the term real freedom in that article, which is very interesting in terms of the later article, Some Free Thinking About Time. That this term real freedom is present with him very early. At a later date, the description of a universe as an unbroken system of necessary connections was actually put forward as Calvinism. It's obvious he's not fond of the theology of Jonathan Edwards. That goes for us. That's pretty clear. It's obvious incompatibility with any real freedom being considered sufficient to entitle it to the name. But this is a sort of Calvinism which Confession of Faith rejects, stating in this second section, although God knows whatever may or can come to pass on all supposed condition, yet hath he not decreed anything, because he foresaw it as future, or as that which would come to pass upon such conditions. So it's very clear, for Prior, real freedom entails no foreknowledge of the future. Foreknowledge of the future takes away real freedom. So push that out into counterfactuals of possible futures, other futures, counterfactual futures. If there is knowledge of these, it determines them also. So it's just more of the same. So that could be maybe one of the reasons why he wasn't. Why didn't he use that thin red line model in his book, Past, Present, and Future? That could be a good question. Why was that model not used earlier on by him? It's difficult to answer, of course, maybe impossible. But I think one argument could be that it would just be adding on more of the same stuff in these other futures. Because foreknowledge of future by itself would take away real freedom. So if real freedom is what you want, you must have the future for yourself. As you say in Some Free Thinking About Yourself. He says, the future is to some extent, even though it is only a very small extent, something we can make for ourselves. So in order to have real freedom, his belief in real freedom. So that's a red thread throughout his authorship, this belief in real freedom, I think. Which is one of the reasons why he rejected Scientia Media in the first place, and really didn't see any reason to take it up. That's my speculation, that he didn't see any reason to bring it into the discussion. And also, had he been alive, to participate in the further discussion with Plantinga and Hasker and those people, I think he would have taken the same route as Van Inwagen and Swinburne, and continued with this belief that the future is something that God could not know, and if he knew it, it would take away real freedom. Yeah. That's it.